Sarah had always dreamed of living a simple, peaceful life surrounded by nature. After years of hard work and saving every penny, she finally managed to buy a small farm on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much at first, just an old wooden barn, a patch of land that needed clearing, and a rickety fence. But it was hers. To Sarah, it felt like paradise. She poured her heart into the farm, planting rows of vegetables, raising chickens and goats, and even growing flowers along the edges of her property. Her two young children loved helping her, running barefoot through the fields and laughing as they chased after the animals. The farm quickly became more than just a place to live. It was a sanctuary. Every morning, Sarah woke up before sunrise to tend to her crops and care for her livestock. The smell of fresh earth, the sound of birds chirping, and the sight of golden sunlight streaming across her fields made her feel alive in a way nothing else ever had. For the first time in years, she felt truly happy. But there was one thing about her new home that bothered her: the Homeowners Association, or HOA. From the moment she moved in, the HOA seemed determined to make her life difficult. They sent letters almost weekly, complaining about everything from the color of her front door to the height of her grass. "Your barn is an eyesore," one letter read. "It must be painted white within 30 days. Another demanded she replace her weathered wooden fence with something more modern. Sarah tried to explain that she didn't have the money for such expensive changes, but the HOA didn't seem to care. Their rules were strict, and they expected everyone to follow them without question. Despite the constant pressure, Sarah refused to give up. She worked tirelessly to keep her farm running while trying to meet some of the HOA's demands. She painted the fence herself, using leftover paint she found in the barn, and planted shrubs along the driveway to soften the look of the property. Still, no matter what she did, it never seemed to be enough. At meetings, the HOA president, a stern woman named Mrs. Harper, would single her out, criticizing her for being non-compliant, and warning her that failure to adhere to the rules could result in fines or worse. Sarah often wondered why the HOA cared so much about her little farm. Was it really hurting anyone? Her neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving hello when they passed by and occasionally stopping to chat. Some even complimented her flower garden or said how much they enjoyed seeing her kids play outside. Yet, whenever she brought this up at HOA meetings, Mrs. Harper would dismiss her concerns, insisting that the rules existed to maintain property values and ensure the neighborhood remained picturesque. Though frustrated, Sarah tried not to let the HOA get to her. She reminded herself why she bought the farm in the first place: to create a better life for her family. And for a while, it seemed like things might improve. Then came the day when everything changed. A phone call in the middle of the night forced Sarah to leave her beloved farm behind, setting off a chain of events that would test her strength, determination, and faith in justice. Little did she know, the HOA's obsession with control would lead to unimaginable consequences and reveal a secret that could change everything. The phone rang in the middle of the night, its shrill sound cutting through the quiet darkness of Sarah's farmhouse. She groggily reached for it, her heart skipping a beat when she heard the voice on the other end. It was a nurse from a hospital several states away, calling to tell her that her estranged father had suffered a massive stroke and was not expected to survive. The news hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her relationship with her father had been strained for years, but he was still family, and she knew she couldn't ignore this. Sarah spent the next few hours scrambling to make arrangements. She called a trusted neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who lived down the road, and asked if she could keep an eye on the farm while she was gone. Mrs. Jenkins, a kind elderly woman who often stopped by to bring fresh-baked bread or share gardening tips, immediately agreed. "Don't you worry about a thing," she said reassuringly. "I'll check on the animals and make sure everything stays safe." Before leaving, Sarah walked through the farm one last time, double-checking locks on gates and ensuring the livestock had enough food and water to last until she returned. She paused by the barn, running her hand over its weathered wooden planks. Despite the HOA's complaints, this old structure held so many memories. Her children's laughter echoing inside as they played hide-and-seek, late nights spent mending tools by lantern light, and countless mornings watching the sunrise from its creaky doorway. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. With a heavy sigh, she locked the barn door and turned away. As she drove off in the early morning light, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The HOA had been unusually quiet lately, which was strange given their history of constant complaints. Still, she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the long journey ahead and the emotional turmoil waiting for her at the hospital. What Sarah didn't know was that back in her neighborhood, whispers were already spreading among the HOA members. Mrs. Harper, the president, saw Sarah's absence as an opportunity. For months, she had been pushing for drastic measures to bring the farm into compliance, but Sarah's stubborn resistance had made progress impossible. Now, with Sarah out of the picture, Mrs. Harper believed she finally had the chance to act without interference. At an emergency meeting called shortly after Sarah left town, Mrs. Harper presented her plan. She argued that Sarah's property was a hazard, a fire risk, she claimed, and insisted immediate action was necessary. Some members hesitated, uneasy about making such drastic decisions without consulting Sarah. But Mrs. Harper dismissed their concerns. "We're doing this for the good of the community," she declared firmly. "If we wait for her to come back, nothing will change." By the time Sarah arrived at the hospital, exhausted and emotionally drained, the wheels were already in motion. Back home, contractors hired by the HOA began arriving at her farm, armed with bulldozers and chainsaws. They started tearing down structures deemed unsafe, ignoring protests from Mrs. Jenkins, who pleaded with them to stop. "You can't do this," she shouted, standing in front of the barn. But the workers brushed her aside, confident in their orders. Unaware of what was happening miles away, Sarah sat by her father's bedside, holding his frail hand and praying for a miracle. She thought about her farm often, wondering how her animals were faring and whether Mrs. Jenkins was managing okay. What she didn't realize was that her peaceful sanctuary was being torn apart piece by piece, and that when she returned, nothing would ever be the same again. Back at Sarah's farm, chaos unfolded under the watchful eyes of Mrs. Harper and her team of contractors. The morning sun had barely risen when the loud rumble of heavy machinery shattered the usual tranquility of the countryside. Bulldozers rolled onto the property, their massive blades gleaming ominously in the light. Chainsaws buzzed as workers began dismantling parts of the barn that the HOA claimed were structurally unsound. Mrs. Jenkins stood nearby, wringing her hands and trying to reason with them, but her protests fell on deaf ears. "This isn't right," she shouted, her voice trembling with frustration. "You can't just tear down someone's property without their permission." One of the workers shrugged, clearly unbothered by her outrage. "We've got authorization from the HOA," he said gruffly. "If you've got a problem, take it up with them." Mrs. Jenkins wanted to argue further, but she knew it was pointless. These people weren't going to listen to her. Instead, she retreated to a safe distance, clutching her phone and debating whether to call Sarah. But what could Sarah do from hundreds of miles away? She was already dealing with enough heartache. Reluctantly, Mrs. Jenkins decided to wait, hoping against hope that things wouldn't escalate further. But they did. As the day wore on, the situation grew increasingly dangerous. The air was dry, and the fields surrounding the farm were covered in brittle grass left over from summer. Sparks flew as the chainsaws sliced through old wooden beams, some of which were still coated in decades-old paint. One stray spark landed in the dry grass, and within seconds, a small flame flickered to life. At first, no one noticed. The workers were too focused on their task, and the breeze carried the smoke away before it became noticeable. But the fire spread quickly, fueled by the parched vegetation and the relentless heat of the sun. By the time someone spotted the growing blaze, it was already out of control. Panic erupted. Workers dropped their tools and scrambled to contain the flames, but their efforts were futile. The fire roared to life, consuming everything in its path. It raced toward the barn, devouring the dry hay stacked inside and sending thick plumes of black smoke billowing into the sky. Flames licked at the edges of the farmhouse, threatening to engulf it as well. Mrs. Jenkins watched in horror, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hand shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. "There's a fire at Sarah's farm," she cried into the receiver. "Please hurry." Fire trucks arrived soon after, sirens wailing, but by then, the damage was catastrophic. Firefighters worked tirelessly to save what they could, but the inferno was merciless. By the time it was finally extinguished, most of the farm lay in ruins. The once vibrant fields were reduced to charred earth. The barn was nothing more than a pile of smoldering debris. And the animals, those that hadn't escaped in terror, were nowhere to be found. Word of the disaster spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the property, staring in stunned silence at the devastation. Some whispered angrily about the HOA's reckless actions, while others looked away, unwilling to confront the truth. Mrs. Harper arrived later, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the scene. When questioned by concerned residents, she defended the decision to bring in contractors, insisting it had all been done for the good of the community. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, there was a flicker of unease. Deep down, she knew this wasn't how things were supposed to go. The plan had been to clean up the farm, not destroy it. But now, with the evidence of their negligence plain for everyone to see, there was no denying the enormity of what had happened. As the sun set over the ruined farm, casting long shadows across the blackened land, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help but think of Sarah. How would she react when she came home to find her dream turned to ashes? And more importantly, who would take responsibility for the destruction that now scared the landscape? And Sarah's life. The hospital room was dimly lit when Sarah finally received the call. Her father's condition had stabilized, though he remained unconscious, and she had been sitting by his bedside, lost in thought. The phone buzzed softly on the small table beside her, startling her out of her daze. It was Mrs. Jenkins. "Sarah," the elderly woman began, her voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know how to tell you this." A cold knot formed in Sarah's stomach as she listened. At first, the words didn't make sense, something about the HOA, contractors, and a fire. But as the story unfolded, the reality sank in like a weight pressing down on her chest. Her farm, the place she had poured her heart and soul into, the home she had built for her children, was gone, destroyed, reduced to ashes while she was hundreds of miles away, powerless to stop it. Her hands clenched into fists as anger and disbelief surged through her. "What do you mean? A fire?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "How could this happen? Who let them do this?" Mrs. Jenkins hesitated before replying, clearly struggling to find the right words. "They said they were fixing things, making the property safer. But something went wrong. The fire spread so fast, Sarah. No one could stop it." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let herself fall apart. Not yet. She thanked Mrs. Jenkins for calling and hung up, her mind racing. For a moment, she just sat there, staring blankly at the wall. The sterile hospital room felt suffocating, its silence amplifying the storm brewing inside her. How could this have happened? Why hadn't anyone stopped them? The next morning, Sarah boarded a flight home, her heart heavy with dread. Every mile that passed brought her closer to the nightmare waiting for her. When she arrived at the farm, the sight that greeted her was worse than anything she could have imagined. The fields she had lovingly tended were blackened wastelands. The barn, once weathered but full of character, was now a pile of charred rubble. Even the fence she had painted herself was gone, leaving behind only twisted metal posts. Standing amidst the ruins, Sarah felt hollow, as if the fire had burned away not just her property, but a part of her soul. Her children clung to her legs, their faces pale with shock as they took in the devastation. Neighbors lingered nearby, offering condolences, but their words felt empty. Nothing could undo what had been done. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Harper appeared, flanked by two other HOA members. Sarah recognized the smug look on the woman's face immediately. It was the same expression she'd worn during countless meetings where she criticized Sarah's farm. This time, however, there was a hint of unease beneath the confidence. "Miss Thompson," Mrs. Harper began, her tone clipped and formal, "we understand this must be difficult for you. But please know that we acted in the best interest of the community. Your property posed significant risks, and we were simply addressing those concerns." Sarah stared at her, incredulous. "In the best interest of the community," she repeated, her voice rising. "You burned down my farm, my home. Where is the best interest in that?" Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably but pressed on. "Accidents happen, Miss Thompson. Unfortunately, this was an unforeseen consequence of necessary actions. We will, of course, assist in any way we can to help you rebuild." The audacity of the statement left Sarah speechless for a moment. Rebuild? With what? Everything she owned was either destroyed or tied up in debts she couldn't afford to pay. And yet, despite her fury, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, "Not everything." As Mrs. Harper turned to leave, Sarah remembered the late nights spent poring over the HOA's governing documents, searching for answers to their relentless complaints. She had stumbled upon something then, a detail so small she almost missed it. But now, standing among the ashes of her life's work, it felt like a lifeline. A loophole buried deep within the fine print, one the HOA had overlooked entirely. For the first time since returning, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she wasn't powerless. Not anymore. That night, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table in Mrs. Jenkins' house, where she and her children had temporarily taken shelter. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. In front of her lay a stack of papers, copies of the HOA's governing documents, legal notices, and emails they had sent over the years. She flipped through them slowly, her fingers tracing the edges as if searching for something tangible to hold on to. Her mind kept drifting back to the day she first discovered the loophole. It had been late at night, after another frustrating HOA meeting where Mrs. Harper had lectured her about non-compliance. Unable to sleep, Sarah had decided to dig deeper into their rules, hoping to find some way to protect herself from their constant demands. That's when she stumbled upon it. A single sentence buried in the fine print of an outdated amendment. According to the document, any new policies or amendments required official registration with the local county clerk's office within 30 days of being adopted. If not, those changes were invalid and unenforceable. At the time, the discovery had felt like a small victory, but nothing more. After all, what could one sentence do against the overwhelming power of the HOA? Now, however, it seemed like the key to everything. Sarah realized that many of the rules the HOA had enforced so aggressively, including the ones they claimed justified tearing apart her farm, were likely based on amendments that had never been properly registered. If true, their actions weren't just reckless, they were illegal. The next morning, Sarah packed up the documents and drove to the county courthouse. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the clerk's desk, unsure whether her hunch would pan out. She explained her situation carefully, asking if there were records of the HOA's amendments being officially filed. The clerk nodded and disappeared into the back room, returning a few minutes later with a thin folder. "I'm sorry," the clerk said apologetically, "but it looks like most of these amendments were never registered. They're not legally binding." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She thanked the clerk profusely, clutching the folder tightly as she left the building. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the parking lot. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to smile. This was it, the evidence she needed to fight back. Later that afternoon, Sarah met with a lawyer named Mr. Carter, who specialized in property disputes. He was a no-nonsense man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. As he reviewed the documents, his expression shifted from skepticism to intrigue. "This is good," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Very good. If what you found is accurate, the HOA has been operating outside the law for years. Their enforcement actions, demolitions, fines, even this fire, they're all potentially invalid." Sarah nodded, her determination growing stronger with each word. "What happens next?" she asked. Mr. Carter outlined a plan. They would file a lawsuit against the HOA, accusing them of negligence, trespassing, and violating property rights. The unregistered amendments would serve as the cornerstone of their case, proving that the HOA had no legal authority to act as they did. Additionally, they could seek compensation for damages caused by the fire, including the loss of her home, livestock, and livelihood. As they discussed strategy, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Winning wouldn't be easy. The HOA had money and influence, but she knew she couldn't give up. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up to injustice and holding people accountable for their actions. Before leaving the office, Mr. Carter offered her a reassuring smile. "You've got a strong case, Sarah. And trust me, once we expose this, the entire neighborhood will be watching." Driving home, Sarah felt a mix of emotions, hope, fear, and resolve swirling together. She knew the battle ahead would be tough, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With the truth on her side and a growing sense of purpose, she was ready to take on the HOA and win. The next morning, Sarah stood on her charred property, staring at the remains of her barn. The air still carried the faint smell of smoke, a constant reminder of what she had lost. But today, she wasn't just a victim. She was someone with a plan. Clutching the folder of evidence from the courthouse, she walked over to Mrs. Jenkins' house and called a meeting with her neighbors. At first, many were hesitant. Some had heard whispers about Sarah's discovery, but didn't want to get involved. Others feared retaliation from the HOA if they spoke out. "What can we do?" One man asked bitterly. "They've been running things around here for years. We're just ordinary people. They'll crush us." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. She opened the folder and laid out the documents, explaining everything in simple terms. "This isn't just about me," she said firmly. "It's about all of us. How many times have they fined you for something ridiculous, or made you spend money you didn't have to fix something that wasn't even broken? They've been breaking the law for years, and now we have proof." Her words struck a nerve. Slowly, people began nodding. One woman raised her hand timidly. "I got a letter last year saying my mailbox was too close to the road. I had to pay $500 to move it 6 inches. Is that really legal?" "No," Sarah replied. "It's not. Not unless they registered those rules, and they didn't." Another neighbor chimed in, his voice tinged with anger. "They tried to evict me because I painted my house blue instead of white. Said it violated some aesthetic standard. I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I gave in. But if this is true..." He trailed off, shaking his head. As more stories came pouring out, the mood shifted. What started as a somber gathering turned into a fiery discussion. People realized they weren't alone in their frustration. Together, they could fight back, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the HOA. Sarah handed out copies of the documents and encouraged her neighbors to share their own experiences. "We need witnesses," she explained. "Anyone who's been treated unfairly by the HOA should come forward. The more voices we have, the stronger our case becomes." Word spread quickly, and soon others joined the cause. Even those who had initially hesitated found courage in numbers. A young couple whose dog had been confiscated for barking too loudly offered to help organize meetings. An elderly man who had been forced to cut down his favorite tree because it blocked a view corridor volunteered to testify in court. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of resistance. Meanwhile, The HOA scrambled to contain the fallout. Mrs. Harper sent letters warning residents not to cooperate with Sarah, claiming her accusations were baseless and intended to disrupt community harmony. But instead of intimidating people, the threats only strengthened their resolve. Neighbors began posting flyers around the subdivision, inviting others to join the lawsuit. Someone created a private online group where members could share updates and coordinate efforts. Local media caught wind of the story, and reporters descended on the neighborhood. Cameras rolled as Sarah stood in front of the ruins of her farm, speaking passionately about accountability and justice. Her sincerity resonated with viewers, turning her into an unlikely hero. Headlines blared, HOA gone rogue. Residents fight back against abuse of power, and woman uncovers shocking loophole that could bring down neighborhood tyrants. With public opinion shifting, Sarah and her growing team filed the lawsuit. It named the HOA, its board members, and the contractors responsible for the fire as defendants. The complaint detailed years of harassment, illegal enforcement actions, and negligence, all backed by the damning evidence Sarah had uncovered. As the days passed, Sarah noticed a change in herself. The fear and despair that had weighed her down after the fire were replaced by a fierce determination. She wasn't just fighting for her farm anymore. She was standing up for every person who had ever felt silenced or pushed aside. And judging by the support pouring in from her neighbors, she knew she wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial, buzzing with anticipation. Reporters jotted notes in the back rows while neighbors filled the benches, their faces tense but hopeful. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Mr. Carter shuffled through papers, his calm demeanor masking the high stakes of the case. Across the aisle, Mrs. Harper and the other HOA board members looked pale and uneasy, flanked by their expensive team of lawyers. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with opening statements. The HOA's attorney launched into a polished defense, painting the organization as a well-meaning group simply trying to maintain order in the community. "We were acting in the best interest of all residents," he declared. "This lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to shift blame for a tragic accident." Sarah clenched her fists under the table, but forced herself to stay calm. She knew this was just the beginning. When it was Mr. Carter's turn to speak, his voice rang out clear and steady. "Your Honor, this case isn't about accidents. It's about accountability. For years, the HOA has operated outside the law, imposing rules that were never legally valid and destroying lives in the process. Their actions led directly to the devastation of my client's property, and they must be held responsible." As the trial unfolded, witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors recounted stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and arbitrary demands. One man described how he'd been forced to demolish a perfectly safe shed because it didn't meet the HOA's vague aesthetic standards. A young mother tearfully explained how she had to choose between paying her mortgage or replacing her front door to comply with a rule that wasn't even registered. Each testimony painted a picture of an organization drunk on power, trampling over the rights of ordinary people. Then came the contractors who had been hired to work on Sarah's farm. Under questioning, they admitted they hadn't followed proper safety protocols during the demolition. Sparks from their equipment had ignited the fire, and panic had prevented them from containing it quickly. Their testimony contradicted the HOA's claim that the blaze was an unavoidable accident. The turning point came when Sarah herself took the stand. Dressed neatly but without pretense, she spoke directly to the judge, her voice steadied despite the weight of her emotions. She described the life she had built on the farm, the early mornings tending to crops, the laughter of her children playing in the fields, the sense of peace she found in nature. Then her tone hardened as she recounted the relentless harassment from the HOA and the shock of returning home to find everything she loved reduced to ashes. "I didn't lose just a farm," she said, her eyes meeting Mrs. Harper's across the room. "I lost my livelihood, my security, and almost my faith in fairness. But what hurts the most is knowing this could have happened to anyone here. They think they're untouchable, but they're not. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. When she stepped down, there was a murmur of approval from the gallery. Even the judge seemed moved, nodding thoughtfully as he reviewed the evidence. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. Mr. Carter delivered a powerful summary, hammering home the illegality of the HOA's actions and the devastating consequences of their negligence. This isn't just about one woman's farm, he concluded. It's about justice, for Sarah, for her neighbors, and for every person who deserves to live free from abuse of power. After hours of deliberation, the verdict arrived. The judge ruled decisively in Sarah's favor, declaring the HOA's enforcement actions null and void due to the unregistered amendments. He ordered the organization to pay substantial damages to Sarah and others affected by their misconduct. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the ruling sank in. Mrs. Harper slumped in her seat, her face pale with disbelief. For Sarah, the moment was bittersweet. No amount of money could bring back what she had lost, but the victory felt like a step toward healing, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered under the HOA's tyranny. As she left the courthouse, surrounded by cheering neighbors and flashing cameras, she allowed herself a small smile. Justice had been served, but the real work was only beginning. With the court's ruling in hand, Sarah began the long process of rebuilding her life and her farm. The financial compensation awarded by the judge was more than she had dared to hope for, but it wasn't just about the money. For Sarah, the victory represented something far greater. A chance to reclaim what had been taken from her and prove that resilience could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The first step was clearing away the remnants of the fire. Neighbors showed up in droves to help, bringing tools, gloves, and determination. Together, they worked tirelessly, hauling away charred debris and leveling the scorched earth. It was hard, grueling work, but there was a sense of camaraderie in the air. Laughter mixed with sweat as people shared stories and meals under makeshift tents. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. As the land slowly transformed, so did the neighborhood. The disgraced HOA dissolved almost overnight, its members too humiliated to continue. In its place, residents formed a new community council, one built on collaboration rather than control. Decisions were made democratically, with input from everyone. Rules still existed, but they were fair, practical, and designed to benefit the entire community. Mrs. Jenkins joked that she hadn't seen so many smiles in years. Sarah poured her energy into designing a new farm, blending modern safety measures with the rustic charm of her original vision. She rebuilt the barn using fire-resistant materials and installed solar panels on the roof to power the property sustainably. Her vegetable garden returned, larger and more vibrant than before, thanks to advice from neighbors who pitched in seeds and expertise. Even her children joined in, planting rows of sunflowers along the driveway as a symbol of renewal. Word of Sarah's story spread beyond the neighborhood, inspiring others facing similar battles with overbearing HOAs or unjust systems. Local newspapers wrote follow-up articles highlighting how one woman's courage had sparked change not only in her community but across the region. People reached out to share their own struggles, seeking guidance on how to stand up for themselves. Sarah became an advocate, speaking at town halls and offering support to those in need. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah stood at the edge of her fields, watching the golden light dance across the freshly tilled soil. Her children played nearby, chasing each other through the tall grass. The scars of the past were still visible, the occasional blackened tree stump or faint burn mark, but they no longer defined the landscape. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she had come. Mrs. Jenkins approached, carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread. "You've done something incredible here, Sarah," she said warmly. "Not just for yourself, but for all of us." Sarah smiled, feeling the deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it alone," she replied. "This farm belongs to everyone now, in spirit, if not in name." That night, As she tucked her children into bed, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. The fire had taken so much from her, but it had also revealed the strength within her and the power of unity. What started as a personal tragedy had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the idea that when people come together, they can create something beautiful from the ashes. And as she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the distant chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves, Sarah knew one thing for certain. Her farm was more than just a piece of land. It was proof that even in the face of destruction, life finds a way to grow again.